Hi, everyone. Welcome to RACS Roadmap for Refugee Policy Reform. My name is Sarah Dale and I'm the Centre Director and Co-Principal Solicitor at RACS. And I'm joined by my colleague, Marcel Rahimi, RACS Policy and Casework Solicitor. I hope all of you can hear us okay. If there's any issues with our sound, please just pop that in the chat. The RACS team will be monitoring the chat and will also be fielding any questions that you have throughout today. And we will hopefully be answering those questions towards the end. If we can go to our next slide. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that RACS works on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As we look ahead to the 2025 federal election, RACS is stepping forward with a clear and compassionate vision for refugee policy in Australia. Every single election shapes the future. And for the thousands of people seeking safety, this one matters very deeply. The RACS Roadmap for Policy Reform was developed as a direct response to this need for change and change that we would like to see from the next Parliament. Next slide.
Before we move on to what we're looking forward to with this election, it's important to also look back and take stock on what we've achieved so far in the last term. So just as a brief summary, in August of 2021, following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, we saw the Action for Afghanistan campaign, which asked for additional places for nationals of Afghanistan in the offshore humanitarian program. And we saw that in March 2022, there was an announcement of 16,500 additional places for these nationals, bringing the total figure to around 26,500 dedicated visas for nationals of Afghanistan under the offshore humanitarian program. At RACS, we've been very pleased to see the greater exercise of ministerial intervention powers for people who are so desperately in need of another chance at protection, who've had changes in their circumstances, changes in their country information, or just have experienced exceptional circumstances since their protection visa has been decided. We also saw that Direction 80 was revoked. Direction 80 was a ministerial direction that prevented people who sought asylum by sea from reuniting with their family due to a persistent deprioritization of their applications for reunion. We also saw that indefinite immigration detention was found to be unconstitutional in a watershed legal case of NZYQ, which reversed almost a 20-year legal precedent. And it's been very exciting to see that Australia is now a bit closer in line with international standards on detention. We also saw that the Immigration Assessment Authority was abolished in recognition of the procedural unfairness of that refugee status determination process. And very warmly, we've been so pleased to see the pathway of permanent residency opened to around 19,280 people through the resolution of status visa. And while it's been important to celebrate these hard-earned wins, that's a product of so much of the effort of people seeking asylum and people with lived experience of displacement, as well as their supporters. We know that the fight is not yet over, so I'll hand back to Sarah to speak through our roadmap for reform.
So as Marcel rightfully pointed out, we were very heartened to see the progression that was made in the last term of government, and that has only made us even more certain that further progress can be made and can be made imminently where there is the appetite to do so. RACS has established 6 different principles for change, and today we would like to discuss those 6 principles with you in further detail. The first being, we would like to see the creation of a permanent pathway for all. That includes providing a secure pathway to permanency for all who are failed by fast track and all those with temporary humanitarian visas. Most people were celebrating, as Marcel has pointed out, the transition to a ROS for those that were on a TPV or a SHEV. But unfortunately, there are still over 1,000 people still waiting for an initial protection finding that would otherwise be eligible for a TPV or a SHEV. And there are another 1,000 people that are still waiting the outcome of that resolution of status ROS visa. So there are 2,000 people that are still stuck in that temporary protection visa framework that we would like to see resolved. That's on top of the 4,000 people that are currently at judicial review. There's another 250 that are at merits review, and another 2,500 people that currently have no legal process on foot. That may include people at ministerial intervention. But what that shows us is that there are several thousand people nationally that are still deeply impacted by the failures of fast track processing that need our assistance. We're also across the many people that are on temporary humanitarian visas. So there are several thousand people from Ukraine who are offered a temporary humanitarian visa who have begun the transition to a resolution of status visa. There are also roughly 1,400 people that have fled Gaza, and also a few Israeli nationals that have been offered that temporary humanitarian visa. But that pathway does not secure a pathway to permanency. And so what RACS would like to see is a universal application of permanency for those that need protection in Australia. And that includes people that were processed through offshore processing and experienced offshore detention. Many of those people are in a pathway to permanency in New Zealand. Some we understand are still exploring the option of Canada. It has been made very clear that those that were slated to be resettled in the US, that has been paused under Trump's directive, and that will leave several hundred people still with no pathway to permanency that were impacted by our offshore detention regime. RACS has called for permanency for those people the entire time that they have been in Australia, but even more so now when we're approaching over a decade of waiting for a resolution. What is also not understood by many is that despite the fact that we saw those holding a temporary protection visa or a safe haven enterprise visa being offered that conversion to the ROS, TPVs and SHEVs are still very much a part of our legal framework here in Australia. So if somebody arrives in Australia by plane without valid documentation or don't clear Australia's immigration clearance, then they are only offered a TPV and or SHEV. So that regime is still very live and well. And for those arrivals, there is no pathway to permanency. So we really want to make sure it's front in mind for our supporters that we need to see the abolition of TPVs and SHEVs. The last point that I wanted to make is that it is essential that we establish a statelessness determination process. Many people that arrive in Australia that are stateless often go through the protection process, and by virtue of their statelessness, they are often persecuted by that statelessness and therefore are eligible under our refugee protection scheme for a visa in Australia. However, there's a lot of nuance around statelessness. There's lots of other issues that need to be considered, and that's why RACS is calling for an independent statelessness determination process. Slide.
The second principle that we're looking at is the abolition of cruel detention and removal policies. It's time to end offshore processing and close all offshore processing centers. This cruel and costly policy has racked up a bill of approximately $13 billion since its revival in 2012. We know, despite there being incredible amounts of secrecy around the offshore processing regime, that there are approximately 100 people currently held in Nauru and 39 people who remain in Papua New Guinea in conditions that are unsafe, with questionable access to healthcare, housing, and critical support services. It's time for the people currently on Nauru and Papua New Guinea who are trapped under Australia's offshore processing regime to be evacuated. In late last year, we also saw the Australian government pass a number of laws, which, among other things, gave them the ability to enter into reception arrangements with third countries to allow for the removal of people seeking asylum and refugees. We saw that earlier this year, the Australian government attempted to remove 3 individuals to Nauru, who they entered these reception arrangements with. Australia must withdraw from these third country reception arrangements and stop removals. And finally, in Australia, we have a mandatory detention framework, which means that detention often operates as a default. People in Australia can be detained without trial, charge, or conviction, and without review of that detention as well. Detention often operates as a default rather than as a last resort, which it should be under international standards. We know that there are around 1,000 people currently in immigration detention, and the average length of time spent in that detention is around 472 days. And in comparable jurisdictions like Canada, that looks like 19 days. So we must be looking at repealing the mandatory detention regime and delivering an effective review of the arrangements for detention for people who are currently detained.
Thanks, Marcel. For Principle 3, we are ensuring that there are procedural safeguards throughout the asylum process. When RACS looks at and thinks about the process of seeking asylum, we think about that from the minute a person arrives in Australia all the way through to their finality of being an embedded member of our community, and that is with a permanent visa and ultimately citizenship. What we are calling on the government to see in our next parliament is that specialist legal and interpreting services are sustainably funded to support people seeking asylum through that entire refugee status determination process. It is, I'm sure for most of you on this call, it is without question that individuals need the support of expert assistance through this process, given its complexity. It's clear for the individuals why they need lawyers, but it's also so imperative for the system that there is that legal support. Legal support leads to better decision-making. It leads to more expedited processes. And so it's better for all of us, not just the individuals impacted, that there is funded legal assistance available for people seeking asylum to engage in this process. We also want to ensure that all people can effectively exercise their right to seek asylum. And that means that no matter where you are seeking asylum in the Australian context, or how you are seeking asylum, you need to be enabled to make that application. RACS has serious concerns around Australia's policy of towbacks. We have serious concerns around enhanced screening procedures that are often used on water around Australia before people are processed and sent to Nauru, as is the current policy. We also have significant concerns around people that are stopped mid-transit, so people that may be coming to Australia by plane that are stopped in a third country before arriving in Australia to seek asylum. And we are particularly concerned about people when arriving in Australia making themselves known to Australian Border Force or airport staff that they need Australia's protection and they need Australia's safety. And when making that declaration on arrival in Australia, being automatically detained and then only afforded temporary protection. So we want to ensure that all people can effectively exercise their right to seek asylum in Australia's jurisdiction. Within that process, we would also like to see an established independent statutory guardian for children in the immigration system. And that is all children in the system, not just those that are in closed detention circumstances. We saw earlier this year that the United Nations found that Australia was in breach of the human rights of the children whom we detained as unaccompanied children on Nauru. Had we had an independent guardian 10 years ago, I would like to think that the outcome would be very different for those children. Australia is required to act in the best interests of children in its care. And where the Minister for Immigration is the guardian for unaccompanied children in this system, it's impossible for them to balance the best interests of those children and their political mandate of the time. And unfortunately, what we have seen time and time again is that those best interests are not priority one. And in fact, the Migration Act explicitly states that the best interest of the child is not a priority where the safety of the Australian community is concerned. And that is where the governments, multiple governments of every colour and flavour, have been able to keep children detained, transfer children to offshore processing centres because they find that those systems are necessary for the safety of the community, thus trumping the best interests of the children involved. So we would like to see an independent guardian established to start challenging some of the processes and the procedures that do not provide for the best interests of children in this process. And finally, we want to introduce procedural safeguards at all stages of the refugee status determination process to ensure that it is full, fair and sensitive to the needs of all people seeking asylum, and all those with protection obligations that cannot be returned to their home countries. RACS has dedicated programs for individuals that need additional services with different nuance and additional complexities. For example, we have a service for children. We have a service for those who are stateless. We have a dedicated service for women at risk. And we also have a dedicated service for people fearing harm based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, or expression. And the reason that we have those dedicated services is so that we can specialise our support to the needs of those particular individuals. Unfortunately, however, our asylum system does not have the ability to adequately respond to the particular nuances and needs of particularly vulnerable people in our community that are seeking asylum. And so we want to ensure that the system is fit for purpose and responsive to the additional complexities and vulnerabilities of the community seeking asylum here in Australia. Thanks. Next slide.
Our fourth principle is looking at providing access to a safety net for people seeking asylum. So while we're all feeling the pinch of the cost of living crisis, this is borne more harshly on people seeking asylum and refugees who are often excluded from mainstream support services, including access to Centrelink or housing. They may also, due to the operation of legal frameworks, not have the right to work or study. And in some cases, even where people do have that right to work, they may not be able to take up employment, owing to a number of factors, including English language ability, physical or mental health concerns, or the necessarily traumatic experience of displacement in and of itself. And while there is currently a safety net that exists, we've seen that it's shrunk over time. But we've seen that funding allocated towards support services for people seeking asylum and refugees has shrunk to around at a rate of around 95% within the past couple of years. And so we've seen that non-governmental organizations and community support services have had to step in and fill that gap. And that's something that at RACS are very grateful for, because I imagine a lot of our partner services are online today and they're providing critical support to people in need. And without that support, they often cannot engage in their legal processes either, because it's hard to focus on your legal matter when you don't have a place to sleep that night. And so while that work of community support services and non-governmental organizations is so critical, it's also oversaturated and critically underfunded. And so it's very important that we're looking to ensure the right to study, work and access Medicare for all people seeking asylum, including those who have failed by the fast track process. At RACS, one of the things that we do in our services is assisting people with applying for the right to work. But we face issues in that when the operation of law mandatorily requires the government to prevent people from working, or provides very high thresholds to meet in order to be granted that right to work. And because that is an issue in the design of the law, until there is a change in that law, there is very little that RACS can do or our clients can do to be able to access employment. And that's why we need this legal reform. And we're seeing that most critically in people who are on a bridging visa E, waiting for their protection visa application to be assessed, are awaiting third country resettlement and critically do not have the right to study, and people who are awaiting the outcome of ministerial intervention requests, and also those who are at judicial review. In addition to this, and as mentioned, even where people have the right to work, there are a number of understandable reasons as to why they cannot take up employment. And so it's so important that there is a universal safety net, that all people in all stages of seeking protection in Australia have access to that critical financial assistance, mainstream social support, sustainable housing and healthcare while they await an outcome.
And now to Principle 5. and that is that we seek to recognise family unity as an essential part of refugee settlement. And what does that mean? So many of the people seeking asylum in Australia have been forced into separation from their families. And quite often, as solicitors at RACS, we are asked by the individuals that are accessing our service for assistance for themselves, but furthermore, for having their families join them in safety here in Australia also. And so that has traditionally, it's been a two-stage process whereby a person is recognised as a refugee, processed here in Australia, and then family reunion is considered a second step. Well, for RACS, we don't want it considered as a second step. We want it considered as part of the process as a whole, because it is very difficult to continue to build your life, set your foundations, start your home without the people that you want living in that home, and that is your immediate family. So at RACS, we're calling on family unity and the reunification of families in Australia to be seen as a critical and essential element of refugee settlement, not just that protection visa or that initial protection finding. What would we need to see that? Well, firstly, we would like to see the humanitarian intake increase to 27,000 places per year, excluding the 10,000 positions for complementary pathways, such as community sponsorship. So as of today, Australia offers 20,000 places in the humanitarian program. What that looks like is 16,000 places for people applying offshore and then 4,000 people that are applying for protection onshore. What we would like the government to do is to de-link those numbers, to no longer include it as a program number fixed as a whole, and for those that are processed onshore to just be processed and not be filled or affected by these caps that the government establish. At this point in time, those 16,000 places from people offshore are looking at approximately 9,000 people in the refugee stream, 4,000 people in the special humanitarian program stream, and another 2,500 in the community sponsorship stream. What we would like to see is those streams expanded to enable more people to access safety here in Australia. To give some context, where we're seeing those 16,000 places in Australia being offered annually, as it would stand, we currently have 280,000 people applying through the Australian Offshore Humanitarian Program. So we're barely making a dent, and there are many, many families that are being forced to remain separated by virtue of these caps and by virtue of these limits. The other context that I wanted to give you in realizing why we want to de-link those numbers and increase those intakes is of those that are applying for protection onshore. There are currently around 30,000 people, of which we're seeing annually move to about 4,000 grants. So that's an exceptionally large number of people that are left waiting in a system for an outcome that Australia could remedy with additional resourcing and doing away with these caps and limits on numbers. As mentioned before, we would also like to see sustainable funded legal assistance for refugees and humanitarian entrants reunite with their families. Whilst traditionally the government has at times funded certain elements of the legal process, there definitely has not been, at least in my time at RACS, that funding for that family reunification piece, which is just so critical to a person with refugee status resettling here in Australia. We also want to see more flexible attitudes to visa processing to account for the unique challenges faced by families from refugee and humanitarian backgrounds. So just as an example, there are a number of countries' travel documents whom the Australian government does not recognise those travel documents. That makes it incredibly difficult for individuals from those countries to meet the identity thresholds that are needed through applying for family stream visas. We also know that with displacement, family structures change, and also it's 2025. There's no such thing as a normal family these days. And so existing in these definitive frameworks of who is considered an immediate family is no longer capturing real life 2025 family units in the present day. So we would like to see some more flexibility around family units and particularly around the age of people considered dependent. So often, as we've seen, people are forced to leave their families behind or be separated on their journeys to Australia. And often people are having to say hard farewells to their young children, 12 or 13 years old. Now, when you come to Australia and the process takes you over a decade, and then you're then looking to bring your family, your wife and your children, you're having to make a really hard decision about whether or not you can leave your now 26-year-old son behind, despite never having the opportunity to be with him for those past 10 years and being separated from him as a child. So we do want to see more flexible attitudes around definitions and age in particular. We would also like family applications to be more affordable, particularly for refugee families who are left to pay the same high fees for partner visas, child visas, and that there is no accommodating for refugee circumstances in those private family streams. We would also like to see urgent processing of citizenship applications lodged by refugees. And also we want to see the prioritisation of special humanitarian visa applications based on the proximity of relationship, not visa class. Now, why have I linked those two together in this setting? It's because when applying for family reunification, the Australian legal system has a prioritisation process of how those applications are assessed and how people become eligible for visas. And as it stands, certain visas holders are a greater priority than others. And the only way to remedy that is once you become a citizen and you become priority one. So as an example, those that hold a ROS, or those that hold the onshore protection visa, so those that hold an 851 or an 866 visa, when applying for their families to join them in safety here in Australia, as they can as permanent residents, their applications are only dealt with as a priority 2. Once they become an Australian citizen, those prioritisation moves to a priority 1 processing. What we would like to see is, irrespective of what refugee visa you hold, if you are indeed a refugee, that family reunification should be treated equally across all visa types. And whereby that is not a possibility, then we must see expedited processing for citizenship, not only for family reunion, but also so people have greater access to the protection of now being an Australian. For refugees that do have those permanent visas, they are eligible for what's called a convention travel document, but not an Australian passport until which time they are a citizen. That travel document creates barriers to travel in certain countries. It makes it much more difficult for them to be visiting family and reuniting families in certain countries. And so what we would like to see is an alleviation of those burdens on refugees that continues despite being permanent residents in Australia. Principle 6.
So our 6th and final principle is an improvement to Australia's response to humanitarian crises. So we've seen that the Australian government's response to crises in recent years across Afghanistan, Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza have been distinctive. While some have had the benefit of the right to work, the right to study, access to healthcare, access to social supports, others have been left in limbo or with little supports. The unpredictability of Australia's responses can often leave family members in the Australian community confused and unsure of where to go or how to respond when their loved ones are in need. So we're looking and we're calling for the government to be implementing a more strategic, coherent, and equitable response to humanitarian crises by adopting an evacuation framework to streamline and harmonise Australia's response to humanitarian crises. And we'd like to draw everyone's attention particularly to the Caldor Centre's recent publication on an evacuation framework that could support the Australian government with moving towards this more equitable framework. But I think that brings us to the end of our roadmap, and now to our question and answer section.
We don't have any questions so far, so I'm just going to give you one last opportunity to pop them in the chat. Well, we're just seeing if there are any questions from the audience today. I did just want to remind you that RACS, with a number of our partners, the Asylum Seeker Centre, House of Welcome, the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre and Jesuit Refugee Service, will be presenting a candidates forum in the Wentworth electorate. So that will be held at Waverley Library on the 27th of April. At the end of this, we'll pop up the details if you would like to join us at that forum, where we will be speaking with candidates in Wentworth on their refugee policies and what we can expect from them if they were to be the elected leaders of Wentworth. I've seen a few things pop up in the chat, so I'll just hand over to Sue-Ann, who will ask us the questions.
All right, so we've had a couple of related questions around whether we've run this roadmap past any politicians and what our plans are to do that, to discuss it with them.
So our roadmap is not yet specifically passed through any of the politicians. What RACS wanted to be sure about was that this is a roadmap irrespective of who is in government. So whether we have a coalition government, whether we have a Labor government, whether we have a minority government, whether we have a majority government, to RACS, what our asks are and what we want to see remains the same. And we have relationships with multiple different people across the federal government and now the state government. And as soon as we know who those leaders are and who will be responsible for each their platforms, we will be meeting with them shortly after the election to discuss this roadmap. But maybe Marcel, you would like to reflect on our engagement with our lived experience advisory panel in how we frame these roadmaps.
So one of the programs that we have at RACS is our lived experience advisory panel, and this is constituted of a number of people who have the lived experience of displacement, of seeking protection in Australia. And these principles were developed in tandem and with the oversight of this group as well. So it's been very important in RACS's advocacy and in the design of this roadmap that we look back not on what we've done, and not just on what we've done in the past couple of years and what we've achieved, but to also make sure that our advocacy and the delivery of our legal services are always grounded in the needs of the communities that we stand alongside with and support. And I think, as Sarah said, we'd always want to reiterate that it is these communities that we stand by and that we'll continue to advocate on. And it's RACS's priority to highlight these issues in the lead up to the election and make sure that we're always shining a light on what it is that the people that we support need the most.
We've got a couple of follow-up questions on this topic. So someone would like to know, Julie would like to know how successful RACS has been in getting access to politicians and whether they listen to us when we do get that access. Similar question from John is, what is the likelihood of either party meeting some, if not all, of the principles?
So as we heard from Marcel at the beginning of this, we did see the needle move in the last term of government. So we are heartened to see that through various different levels of engagement. So whilst RACS does get the opportunity to meet with senators, MPs and ministers fairly regularly to discuss these issues, we also engage in submissions to Parliament. So when there are Senate inquiries called, quite often we make submissions to those Senate inquiries. We're very delighted when we are often invited to then attend committee hearings to discuss our submission. And what we have seen over the past few years is that there has been traction in what RACS is saying. We are seeing our policy submissions referred to not only in the final reports, but also in dissenting reports where all different sides of government are referencing RACS and our expertise where we are seeking to make those changes. So we saw the conversion to the ROS. We've seen an increased engagement in ministerial intervention. And so I do like to think that RACS, we might not always be agreed with at this point, but we are being listened to at this point in time, which has been a big change over the last term of government. As to the likelihood of each of the parties, I will leave that to you to have a look at each of the parties. I know that the Greens have sent out their policy framework. I know that the ALP have made a significant number of promises over the year. A number of those promises remain outstanding. We haven't yet seen anything specific from the coalition that we could reflect on at this point in time. But I think, very high level, both the coalition and the ALP support offshore processing. The ALP have been more forthright in standing for permanency for those that are seeking Australia's protection, and we're heartened that they have taken that step, but it does need to go significantly further. So it is universal for all people seeking asylum and refugees. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think just reiterating the fact that I guess some of the things we reflected on at the beginning in terms of the progress were the product of many years of work, and in circumstances where politicians are not always receptive to the things that we've been calling for. And I guess despite the response that we might be receiving from government, these are positions and priorities that RACS has stood strong on and will continue to stand strong on. And while we hope to see that movement, regardless, we'll be fighting for it.
We're here for the long game. Any other questions, Joanne?
I've got a question here from Candice. What is your response to views that the refugee intake is driving up housing and cost of living crisis situation?
Great question, and I wish I had the migration data in front of me to help address that. I mean, we have had many of the people that are seeking asylum and refugees that are here in this community have been in our community for 10 years or more. We didn't have this housing crisis 10 years ago when they were arriving. So why now is this community suddenly being a cause of blame for this? So, we would say that absolutely this is not driven by refugees, people seeking asylum. This is a planning issue from the government, which I'm not going to get into because that's a whole different hat that I do not wear. But I think many of the people that we are advocating for in this platform under these principles are people that have been here for over a decade and are already established members of our community. Similarly, those that we are advocating for in increasing the humanitarian intake is really looking at addressing family reunion. So it's really about bringing, wives with their husbands and children with their parents. And so I think practically speaking, it's not going to be this, inundation issue that is often this community is brushed with. If I had been separated from my family for 10 years and they were suddenly coming to Australia, they would be with me in my home that I am already living in. So I think just what is really difficult around this is that when we talk about numbers, people get inflamed and anxious about that, particularly when looking at cost of living. But I think it's really important that when asked these kinds of questions, that we bring it back to the issue here, and that is that of humanity. And really, what is the practicality of what we're asking? And it's not 30,000 people that need 30,000 individual homes. It's kids to come and live with their parents.
Absolutely. I guess one additional comment on that in terms of the policies that we're currently seeing and the impact that has on various Australian communities. One of the pieces of feedback that we got from our lived experience advisory panel is that when people didn't have the right to work or to support themselves, those costs end up being shouldered by their communities, or those costs end up being shouldered by organizations that had to fill in those gaps where people, couldn't afford their own housing, couldn't afford their own food or their own Opal card. So in light of these cruel policies that are inhibiting people from actually supporting themselves, people who are skilled, people who want to work, people who want to support themselves and their family, people who want to contribute to Australia, but don't have the legal ability to. That's having a flow-on effect on Australian communities as well. And so, in addition to bringing it back to humanity, we're seeing that our current framework is also not fit for purpose for actually addressing some of these concerns. Which is why it's a whole of package reform that we're looking at.
Yeah, and I think just really anecdotally, and I'm going off tangent a little bit, but I've got the mic so I can. What often frustrates me in this system, and having worked at RACS for so long and speaking with the community that we speak with, is that Australia is often talking about the fact that we have an aged care worker crisis, that we don't have enough people working in our hospital systems, that we need more people in the construction industry in order to build the more homes. And there are, 3 constant gaps that are being discussed in the media right now in terms of skills in Australia. For the big majority of the people that I have worked with over the decade, they are currently working in those roles. A RACS ambassador, for instance, Mo Sakavidi, he's working with people seeking asylum to access jobs in the construction industry. So many of the communities that we're working with are actually working in industries where there are those skill gaps. And so really, we should be celebrating and realizing that the contribution that they're making, particularly in areas that Australia is in crisis, it is being filled by people seeking asylum and refugees. Any other questions?
We've got a few more minutes and a few more questions. So the first couple are kind of practical ones. We've talked about family and children, and a couple of people are asking what the average wait time for children's visas is and the time for citizenship after passing the citizenship test. And then I've got one more after this.
Okay. I don't have a very good answer for that, and I can't quickly look it up for you, but often wait times are recorded on the Department of Home Affairs website. So if anyone is asking those specific questions, you can have a look to see how long the wait times are on specific visas. In terms of citizenship, I can say that I got to attend a citizenship ceremony this week for a number of people that we have been working with who applied for citizenship, went through the process about 12 months ago. So we have seen a kind of a decrease in that waiting time for citizenship over the past couple of years. So I would say roughly it's probably 12 to 18 months at this point in time. But I would want to go back and just check those waiting times with the department unless you knew.
No, I think they're publicly recorded on the department website, and that's probably the best protocol.
Great.
And final question is, how can people on this call, our supporters, amplify this roadmap?
Oh. Great, thank you. So our roadmap is available on our website. So please jump on. You can refresh yourself of all the details of the principles and how we would like to see those principles applied in practice. We also have everything available on our socials, so please follow us on Instagram, jump on our Facebook. You will see that we have been discussing each of those principles individually, and that's all available for you to share. What I would really love is I don't think I've ever seen the level of kind of door knocking and engaging by MPs and senators this election than in elections prior. So if you are coming across people running for parliament and they're asking for your vote, what you can do is ask them what they're doing to stand for refugees and what are they doing to stand for the issues that are close to your heart. Even if this is not an issue that is going to decide a person's vote, it's really important for all of our leaders to know that this is something that the Australian community is thinking about, that this is something the Australian community ultimately wants to see. Often when we're meeting with MPs and senators, they say to us, yeah, I get what you're saying and I really want Australia to be welcome and compassionate towards refugees, but this is not an issue that my constituents are raising with me. So it's really important that before the election, after the election, whoever it is that is representing your local area, you reach out to them and you say, hey, I support RACS and I support their roadmap to refugee reform. And I really want to see you as a leader standing for these principles as my local representative. Anything else?
I think that summarizes everything really well. And I guess just a thank you to everyone for attending as a first step to better understand this roadmap. And I hope you're all feeling a bit more equipped to have these conversations, to amplify these asks.
So on that note, we will just pop in the chat the link to our roadmap on our website. Also, just a reminder about the Wentworth Candidates Forum for those in Sydney. We would love for you to join us. If we can jump to the next slide, please. Would love for you to join us there. You can jump on socials. There are lots of candidate forums being held around Australia. We encourage you to attend. We encourage you to ask your local representatives if they will attend and speak to the issues that are important to you. So thank you for doing so, and thank you for continuing to stand with us for and with refugees, people seeking asylum, the stateless and displaced. See you next time.